The rain stopped around 4 in the afternoon, and the silence it left behind made my ears ring. After 3 days of it hammering the windows, that sudden nothing felt wrong, like the last note of a song you didn't know was playing. I probably should have left it alone. My name is Justin. I was 17 that summer, and I want you to understand something about me. Before I get into what happened, I wasn't the kind of kid who went looking for trouble. I was the kind of kid who got bored enough that trouble started looking like a pretty good time. There's a difference. Marginally. My parents had gone to the beach for the weekend, which sounds like the setup for a party, but was actually the setup for me and my cousin Martin sitting in my room for 4 days straight, playing whatever we could scrape off the bottom of my Steam library. Martin was 15, 2 years younger than me, and he had this quality I can only describe as relentless. When he decided he was going to do something, he did it. No filter between the thought and the action, which was sometimes fun and sometimes exhausting, and eventually, as it turned out, terrifying. The rain had been killing me. My bedroom smelled like socks and cold pizza, and I was starting to forget what the sun looked like. So when the downpour finally quit and I saw actual gray daylight through the window, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I went into my dad's study and took his telescope. He told me the study was off limits, not in a dramatic way, just the way parents say things they expect you to follow. The telescope was expensive, German, matte black, the kind of equipment that comes with a padded carrying case and a little desiccant packet to protect it from moisture. I told myself I'd be careful. I told Martin the same thing. Martin grabbed the tripod before I finished the sentence and was already heading for the front door. We walked for maybe 40 minutes before we found high enough ground. A hill on the east side of the neighborhood that backed up against what used to be farmland. The grass was soaked and my sneakers were ruined about 5 minutes in, but I didn't care because I was outside and the air smelled like cut grass and mud and everything that wasn't my bedroom. We set the telescope up and pointed it roughly west, where the clouds were breaking apart. I was expecting stars eventually, maybe the moon if we got lucky. Martin pushed in front of me before I got a look through the lens. He went quiet. That was the first thing that was wrong. Martin was never quiet. He stayed that way for almost a full minute, just staring into the eyepiece, and then he straightened up and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not scared. More like someone who just figured something out that he shouldn't have. "There's a cemetery down there," he said, still looking through the glass like he couldn't quite pull himself away. I looked. Maybe a half-mile away, at the bottom of the slope where the tree line thickened, I could make out a low stone wall through the lens. Inside it, grave markers. Old ones, the kind that lean. The ruins of something bigger sat just beyond the far wall. A foundation, or what was left of a church, one of its stone walls still partly standing. The whole thing was half-eaten by overgrowth. Before I could say anything, Martin was already moving. I'm not going to pretend I didn't follow him. I did. I grabbed the telescope off the tripod and carried it down a muddy hillside in wet sneakers because I wasn't going to leave it up there alone. By the time I reached the stone wall, Martin had already gone inside. The graveyard was small, maybe 30 markers total, crowded in no particular order. The grass inside the wall was ankle-high and damp and smelled like standing water that hadn't seen sunlight in way too long. Something alive moved in the ruins of the church foundation, small and quick, a bird or a rat, and then stopped. Didn't leave, just stopped. Most of the stones were too weathered to read. The dates I could make out were old, mid-1800s, a few from the early 1900s. The light had gone flat and gray, that thick overcast that turns everything the same color, and the tree line on the far side of the wall made the whole place feel sealed, like the world ended at those trees. Martin was crouched in front of one of the smaller markers. Granite, maybe 18 inches tall, relatively clean compared to the others. I walked over. The name on it was Alta Lune. Below that, 1891-1934. Below that, in lettering that was still legible, beloved and remembered. Kind of a weird name, I said. But Martin wasn't listening. His hand was already in his pocket, coming out with a Sharpie. I told him to stop. He ignored me the way he ignored everything when he had already decided something. He wrote his ex-girlfriend's name across the stone in thick black letters. big, ugly block capitals, the marker squeaking against the granite. Then he straightened up and looked at me, and something in his expression made it clear he felt nothing about what he had done. "Let's go," he said. I stood there for a second looking at what he had done. The black ink sat on top of the stone like a wound. Something about the contrast bothered me in a way I couldn't put into words. The stone had been so much cleaner than the others, and now it wasn't. Now it looked like something had been taken from it. I said, "Stop." Then I stood there and watched. I want to be clear about that. We walked back mostly in silence. By the time we got home, the light was dying. Hours later, I fell asleep around midnight. Something woke me at 3:17. Not a sound. The absence of one. My house makes noise at night. Small structural sounds, pipes settling, the AC cycling. This was the first time I noticed them stop, all of them, at once, like the house had decided to hold its breath. Then Martin screamed. Not a short scream. A long one, ragged at the edges, the kind that means your brain has short-circuited and your body is making noise on its own. I was in the hallway before I knew I was moving. His door was shut and I hit it with my shoulder. It opened. I slapped the light switch. Martin was pressed into the far corner of the room with his back against the wall, as far from the bed as the room allowed. He was standing upright. That meant he had been awake. That meant whatever had come for him found him awake and watching. His hands were at his throat. The room smelled like copper and wet earth. Not metaphorically. Distinctly. I noticed it before I noticed anything else. On the left side of Martin's neck, 4 parallel marks running from below his ear toward his collarbone. Not scratches. The skin was raised and red and already purpling at the edges, and they were spaced exactly the way a hand's fingers would be spaced if someone had grabbed him from behind. The 2 middle ones were deeper than the outer ones. He tried to explain 3 times and stopped each time. The closest he got, she was standing at the foot of the bed. She smelled like dirt after rain. She wasn't angry. That was the part that kept catching in his throat when he tried to say it. She wasn't angry, she just reached for him. Martin didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on his floor until morning with the lamp on, both of us not talking, and every time I started to drift I would snap awake, convinced something had changed in the corner of the room. The lamp threw shadows behind the dresser that I kept watching without meaning to. Nothing moved. But I watched anyway. By the time the sun came up, Martin knew what he had to do. He took cleaning supplies from under the kitchen sink, a scrub brush, dish soap, a bottle of rubbing alcohol. By mid-morning he was gone. 2 hours later he came back. He sat at the kitchen table and poured a bowl of cereal and stared at it without eating. His collar was pulled up. Nothing happened to Martin after that. That's the version of the story I've been telling myself. But I went back to that graveyard once more. Last spring, alone, because I needed to see the stone for myself. Altaloon, 1891-1934. Beloved and remembered. The name Martin wrote was gone. He had done a good job. At the base of the marker, there was a small bundle of dried flowers tied with brown twine. The petals hadn't fully browned yet, which meant they were recent. A few days, maybe. We hadn't told anyone where we had been. I stood there for a long time trying to come up with an explanation. Somebody local. A coincidence of timing. I drove home and didn't go back. But Martin's ex-girlfriend, the one whose name he wrote on that stone, changed her phone number 6 months after that summer. Won't tell anyone why. I don't know if that means anything. What Martin said keeps coming back to me. That she wasn't angry. I think about whatever left those flowers.